Everybody, how are you? Wow, this has been an interesting experience the last, 4 days? I'm sure you're all really dealing with a lot in your immediate environment and personal life, trying to juggle classes, moving. Wow. Hi. We're going to be conducting class remotely for a while. And this is the first video lecture I am preparing for you in relationship to our materials. I'll be trying to put up one of these every scheduled class meeting that we were supposed to be having face to face. And there's a lot of information I need to push to you right now. Hopefully, this will kind of even out and become a more routine process as we move forward. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through this PowerPoint that I put together for today. And then I have a lot of reminders for you and some new course components that I'm going to remind you about as I move through this slide deck. First of all, I'm just calling this reminders for the coronapocalypse because that's what we're living through in the moment. We're actually really close to entering our unit on the AIDS crisis because we're very close to the late 70s, early 80s in our course timeline. So a lot of what we're going to be looking at in the next few weeks is actually eerily similar in some ways to the kind of government mismanagement, lack of response, and pandemic kinds of viral pathways that we experienced in the early 80s through the mid 90s. So that will be interesting, and perhaps we can work together talking about connections and similarities and differences between the AIDS crisis and the current situation. Um, my first recommendation is just to do things to stay safe. That's everything from washing your hands and kind of obeying the scientific recommendations on social distancing to, making sure you're making good decisions about money, shelter, workload if you can, your food intake, alcohol intake, things like that. This is going to be a durational situation. We're going to be probably shut up in our homes for quite a while. So make good decisions every day that will keep you functional and keep you hydrated, nourished, etc. My other recommendation is worry less. Yes, we do have some deadlines in this class. Yes, there is a final exam in this class. Really, with the exception of the discussion entries schedule, which we're going to try to stay on track with. Um, Most things in the class are going to be more flexible now, given that we have to do most things asynchronously. So try to develop your own kind of schedule with this. If you are a little late commenting on discussion entries, please don't worry about that. Just do your best to keep up with the content. And if anything isn't working for you, please just alert me as soon as you can. Um, One way I'm trying to make things a little bit more accessible is I've created a Slack workspace for us for our class. So when I send you the update email about this video lecture being posted, you will get a link invite to that Slack space. If you download Slack onto your phone, or if you work on a laptop or desktop, you could actually go to Slack like on those platforms. You should be able to sign into that workspace, and we'll be able to see each other, share files, create channels and threads there. So if you're needing to get a hold of me, that is a more immediate way to do so than emailing. I'm getting a lot of email with a lot of different types of requests. You might try Slack. It's just easier to use, less clunky. So I've set that up for us. So check that out. Also, I'm highly aware that some of you may not have yet gotten a hold of the last book we're reading, The Gentrification of the Mind by Sarah Schulman. Um, you might have a paper copy, you might not. If you don't, I've made sure that the GVSU libraries have an e-copy of that book. So you should be able to go to the library's website and pull that book in PDF sections onto a device. You should also just be able to read it directly on the website. So hopefully that means that everyone has the materials they need. If not, let me know. Also, if you are in a household where you do not have direct access to a computer, or maybe someone like a parent is working on the one computer in the house for work and you can't use it all the time, you might consider downloading the Blackboard app. That will let you at least do some of the functions of Blackboard on a phone or a tablet, and that could be good for like checking updates or reading discussion threads or typing out discussion entries. So just consider doing that as like a secondary way of accessing Blackboard. We are continuing with all the setup, like Blackboard setups that we were using. We're continuing with all those. Ideally, especially I would say with discussion entries, it is important for the people who are assigned discussion entries to continue posting them on the regular schedule. They are providing the sort of backbone for our in-class discussion. It's only once every 4 weeks, so I would ask that you please do pay attention to those dates and please do make all concerted efforts to get your work in by that 7 p.m. deadline whenever you're writing one. Um, Also, I'm asking all of you to try to comment on all the Blackboard discussions. This might not be synchronous. You might have to go back and fill some things in. But this really is the main way that we are measuring showing up in the course at this point. So I'm asking you not only to participate in all those discussions, but also to beef up your responses a bit. I'm looking for about 100 words per entry if possible. Or if you wanted to be more creative or getting tired of typing, you could make a quick video on your phone or a sound file using voice notes and actually upload that in the discussion window as a way of kind of connecting with us. So yeah, consider getting a little creative with these. Lastly, just because we haven't had time to onboard the final project in person, I am now going to switch over to a prompted open book essay exam. I will allow for some flexibility with that assignment, but it'll be standardized for everybody and should be something you can work on remotely, just reviewing materials from the course. Okay, so really quickly, I did not have a super well laid out lecture prepared for this material because we were going to do an in-class activity. So I'll just talk about a few things here in relationship to these materials today, and then we'll talk again on Thursday. But and this image is a flyer from the Gay Liberation Front. You can see what kinds of advertising they were using to attract membership. This is an all-white crowd, but it is a gender-integrated crowd. We kind of noted that last class, like who tended to belong to these liberation groups. And the new politics of coming out is something they were really using to grow their membership. So it's quite interesting to see. These are people about your age, I would guess, which is, think about how 50 years ago people your age were engaging in this kind of organizing. So we are in Unit 4 still. We're looking at the gay liberation period. And for today, I had you take a look at, I believe, 5 different kind of short manifestos written by various gay liberation groups. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time today just slowing down and thinking about the manifesto as a world-making form. So we've talked about world-making in the past in relationship to different kinds of queer cultural production, the kinds of things queer people make. And manifestos are one of those things. So what is a manifesto? Traditionally, it is a list of public demands for justice. Lots of different groups have issued manifestos, and we are looking specifically at LGBTQ ones. The word manifesto comes from a Latin root manifestus, meaning to make obvious or to make public, which makes sense if you think, people making their demands public in an obvious way. Usually these are written in really plain language and posted publicly on telephone poles or handed out as leaflets, made very easily available, printed in newspapers, etc. And we are looking at primary historical sources here. They are a first-hand account of the author's experience, like what people were experiencing at the time. You can see some of these are hand illustrated or typed out on typewriters, right? You could actually think about the various resources the different groups had available to them by looking at how the documents are laid out, who had access to secretarial pools and typewriters and nice paper, who didn't. It's an interesting thing to think about here. As formal statements of purpose and demands for change, manifestos are a great way to get a window into people's subjective political experience. So, what were people experiencing on an individual basis that would make them form these collectives that Fawaz wrote about for last week, right? Um, Fawaz writes a lot about the benefits of these collectives forming that allowed people to try out new types of politics in small kind of domestic settings, right? Um, there was a really interesting quote in that piece about how, gay liberation activists had all these ideas about queerness, but they couldn't be sure they would work culturally unless they tried living this way, right? Like, what would it mean for a group of gay men to live in a collective community? What would it mean for a bunch of trans people to buy a house and try to um, set up a kind of youth shelter? People were inventing queer culture. Um, they had a theory of how it would work, but they didn't necessarily know how that would shake out in practice. So we see people experimenting, we see them writing these kinds of documents to mark why they're doing that. We actually started out class looking at a manifesto. I believe on the first day we read a little bit of Queers Read This, which was a manifesto, an AIDS era manifesto from 1990. So we've seen this format before, and we're coming back around to it. So just to kind of remind you, remember that these world making forums always reflect these four basic qualities that we've talked about, such as a shared history of criminalization or criminal intimacy. We can see this when we look at who belongs to these various groups and their reasons for joining. There's a sense of shared stigmatization that a lot of these groups have, or shared oppression. They're banding together for specific reasons that have to do with how society has treated them as outcasts, others, less valuable, right? And what's interesting to note here is this is true not only of the dominant society, but also of the other LGBT groups, which some people noted. Secondarily, these groups all are asking for a different world of some kind. And they all have an idea of what the primary problem is with the world that they want to have changed. So they're seeking to transform the world, and they're laying out their kind of vision for that. And they have demands about how to solve that problem. So, in terms of elaborating this idea of belonging and transformation, they each are kind of identifying core issues that need to change in order for the problem to be solved and that different world to come into being. And then lastly, they are looking to produce new social formations. So we didn't talk much about the Ramsey Fawaz Collectives reading, but clearly those groups are taking both social and political action to develop new types of sociality, new types of kinship, new types of family, experimental living, right? They're buying land, they're building buildings, they're creating rituals, they're developing resources. They're doing all kinds of things to try to model different ways of having a world, right? So they are taking actions to realize their goals. This can be as limited as looking to change laws to as radical as something like Lesbian Nation, right? Which was this idea that lesbians would slowly build an entirely different country, kind of inside the current country, where they would own land and run businesses and shop at each other's businesses and educate each other's children, right? So this could be from a very small kind of reformist scale to a super transformational radical scale. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the responses people had. There were kind of two questions on the discussion post. One was, what surprised you? And the other was, were there key alliances that you could see between the groups? So the first response I wanted to kind of pick up on here was someone who wrote that they were surprised there were so many different groups at the time striving for so many different things. And I think, again, remember, this goes all the way back to the monolithic error that we talked about at the beginning of class, that we are taught a very kind of simplified idea of LGBTQ culture and history, that kind of all queer people have the same problems, and there are kind of universal solutions to those problems, when really, when we look carefully at what people were demanding, we see a lot more diversity, a lot more complexity. And that comes through really clearly here in the early 70s with these documents. Um, this person also notes that surprised to see bisexual activists organizing. And, absolutely, right? Bi people were realizing that there wasn't much room for them in a gay and lesbian dominated movement. And so they were organizing to try to articulate the specific problems with that structure. Um, Someone else noted that even though 50 years have passed, a lot of these things still seem like things we haven't gotten yet or things people are still asking for. And that has a lot to do, well, first, yes, right? Secondarily, that has a lot to do with shifts that happened in gay politics after the AIDS crisis that kind of hijacked a lot of this more radical stuff we're looking at. So we will talk about and look at that shift from a more radical world changing, world making style to a more assimilationist kind of what we want to be normal style. We can see some, like the groups like Mattachine, particularly, that activism should look quite familiar to us. But some of these other groups were asking for a lot more radical demands. Someone else was talking about how the tone of this activism is quite different, right? It doesn't sound like the type of kind of mainstream gay rights discourse that we might have grown up hearing about. These people are angry. It can be a little scary almost or alarming to look at how intense this stuff is, and it's certainly not written with maybe the same tone we're used to. And that should tell us a lot about how far we've kind of traveled away from the style of activism that was a lot more predominant in the 70s, right? A lot of things have changed. The demands have gotten really watered down, and the tone has really changed to a much more kind of polite and respectable type of activism. And we could think maybe about why that has taken place. And then lastly, an interesting note here. Someone brought up the fact that the Gay Manifesto actually mentions that marriage should be gotten rid of, right? I talked about this with you maybe in the third week of class, that like some gay activists were really saying, hey, marriage is an oppressive institution that oppresses women and creates inequality, and we should get rid of it. And here we finally see in the Gay Manifesto 1970 people saying that, right? So here's a potential alliance between feminist and gay politics around that. It makes you wonder where that line of reasoning went. We'll talk more about that later. Some potential alliances people pointed out, right? I thought it was really interesting that people saw possible connections between the lesbian group and the trans group Star, right? Both along the lines that these groups were pointing out that they were being mistreated by white gay men, and their issues were being ignored by that group, right? So there really is a potential here for sort of radical lesbian and trans politics to align in ways that didn't end up actually taking place because of a kind of restrictive definition of womanhood that some radical lesbian groups started using that excluded transgender women. Um, but we do see a potential connection there. Um, Another interesting alignment that people pointed out were between bisexuals and trans people. And if you think about it, it makes sense because trans people and bi people are both experiencing problems because they are caught between binaries. The bi people are dealing with a binary of gay straight and they're being excluded from that binary, and then the trans activists are dealing with a binary of man woman and being excluded from that binary. So we could think about what might be some strategic alliances that bi and trans activists could have developed. So that's all to say that we need to think about the complexity of this moment to really understand the real breadth of what people were demanding and thinking about, and how they were starting to live in these radical new ways and experimenting with new forms of politics. It was a really exciting time. It's a time that crashed immediately into the AIDS crisis where things changed dramatically. But to really get a sense of the depth and breadth of gay liberation, we need to look at these primary materials to see what people were imagining. Okay, so that's really all I have about the content for today. Don't forget, one, I'm going to have you go back to the discussions tab. Actually, it'll be that way for you. And I've put up a little prompt about this slideshow just to get you thinking a little bit about the content like we would in class. So as soon as you're done viewing this video, please go to the discussions and just give me a little bit of thinking in relationship to that question. Two, I will be putting up a discussion entry for group 1 in response to the material for next class. So please make sure to be posting that by 7 p.m. tomorrow, just as usual. I am asking again everybody to try to comment on all discussions. If not in real time, then catch up and comment when and where you can. And I will be back in touch with you with another video lecture about our material on Thursday. So in the meantime, if you need something, you can join the Slack group and message me there, or you can send me an email. I'm happy to help you out as I can, and I hope you're all doing well.